Meet Elena Rodriguez, 29 years old, with raven black hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, wearing faded jeans and a worn leather jacket that had seen better days. She stood at the edge of Skyline Aviation Academy's pristine runway, clutching a clipboard and watching the expensive jets taxi past with quiet intensity. Her deep brown eyes missed nothing, but she rarely spoke unless spoken to first. Elena worked as a flight operations coordinator, the person who scheduled training flights, managed paperwork, and ensured the hangar stayed organized. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid the bills and kept her close to the aircraft she loved. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Academy was a playground for wealthy aviation enthusiasts and military hopefuls with deep pockets. Most students arrived in luxury cars, wearing designer flight suits, and talking loudly about their family connections or trust funds. They treated Elena like part of the furniture, someone who existed to serve their needs but wasn't worth remembering. She processed their flight requests, refueled their aircraft, and cleaned their cockpits while they boasted about their flying. Achievements at the Academy's exclusive bar. Elena had been working at Skyline for 8 months, and in that time, she had never once been inside a cockpit during flight. The students assumed she was just another ground crew member who probably got airsick and had never flown anything more complex than a commercial airliner. They weren't entirely wrong about her background, but they had no idea what they were missing. She would arrive before dawn, stay late into the evening, and handle every tedious task that kept the Academy running smoothly, all while listening to conversations about flight maneuvers, weather patterns, and aircraft performance. The Academy star student was Captain Marcus Blackwood, a 35-year-old former Air Force pilot who had transitioned to civilian aviation after serving 2 tours overseas. Marcus was everything Elena wasn't: confident, loud, and constantly reminding everyone of his military credentials. He flew an expensive Cessna Citation jet that his family's law firm had purchased for business trips, and he never missed an opportunity to mention how it cost more than most people's houses. Marcus had perfectly styled blonde hair, a smile that never quite reached his eyes, and the kind of swagger that came from always being the most important person in the room. Every morning, Marcus would swagger into the flight operations office where Elena worked, always wearing his expensive aviator sunglasses and carrying a leather flight bag that probably cost more than Elena's monthly salary. He would drop his flight plan on her desk without looking at her and announce his intentions for the day as if she were his personal assistant. "Schedule me for runway 2800, he would say, already turning away before she could respond. "And make sure the fuel trucks are ready. I don't have time to wait around for ground crew incompetence." Elena would nod quietly and process his requests efficiently. But Marcus had developed a particularly irritating habit of commenting on her appearance and presumed lack of aviation knowledge. "You know, Elena," he would say with that condescending tone he reserved for people he considered beneath him, "if you're ever interested in seeing what real flying looks like, you should watch me take off sometime. Might teach you something about how aircraft actually work." The other students would chuckle at his remarks, and Elena would continue her work without responding. Marcus had nicknamed her Ground Girl and used it constantly, always with that same patronizing smile. "Hey, Ground Girl, did you remember to check the weather report? Ground Girl, make sure my aircraft is positioned correctly this time. Ground Girl, you might want to stay clear of the runway when real pilots are working." Elena never reacted to the mockery, but anyone paying close attention might have noticed how her jaw tightened slightly each time he used that nickname, or how her fingers would drum silently against her desk in a rhythm that resembled something familiar. The Academy's other instructors and students followed Marcus's lead, treating Elena as if she were invisible except when they needed something. They would discuss complex flight maneuvers and navigation techniques right in front of her, assuming she couldn't understand the technical language. They talked about her as if she weren't there, making jokes about how she probably thought autopilot meant the plane could fly itself, or speculating about whether she had ever been higher than the second floor of a building. But Elena had a secret that none of them suspected. Every evening after the academy closed, she would sit in her small apartment studying flight manuals that were decades old, but still perfectly accurate. She would review weather patterns, memorize aircraft specifications, and practice flight calculations using nothing but paper and pencil. Her apartment was filled with aviation books, technical diagrams, and navigation charts that she had collected over the years. She owned a flight simulator program that she ran on an ancient laptop, spending hours practicing approaches, emergency procedures, and aerobatic maneuvers. More importantly, Elena had access to something that Marcus and his wealthy classmates had never seen. In a rented hangar 20 miles outside the city, covered by a dusty tarp and surrounded by old maintenance equipment, sat a 1952 North American T-6 Texan trainer aircraft. The plane looked like it belonged in a museum rather than on an active runway. Its yellow paint was faded, its fabric control surfaces had been patched multiple times, and its radial engine leaked oil onto the concrete floor below. Most modern pilots would have dismissed it as a relic, a toy plane that belonged in an air show rather than serious aviation training, but Elena knew better. She had purchased the T-6 3 years ago with every penny of her savings, plus a loan that she was still paying off with her ground crew salary. The aircraft had been built during World War II and had trained thousands of military pilots before being retired to civilian use. It was a tail-dragger, meaning it had conventional landing gear that made it notoriously difficult to handle on the ground. The stick was heavy, the controls were sensitive, and it required constant attention from the pilot. Modern aviators called it unforgiving because it would punish any mistake immediately and dramatically. Elena had spent countless hours and most of her disposable income restoring the T-6 to airworthy condition. She had learned to rebuild the engine, patch the fabric, and maintain every system without professional help. The work was exhausting and expensive, but it was also deeply satisfying. Every weekend, she would drive to the private airfield where she kept the plane and spend hours in the cockpit, practicing techniques that modern pilots had forgotten. She flew without GPS, without autopilot, and without any of the electronic aids that Marcus and his classmates relied on. She navigated by compass and landmark, calculated fuel consumption manually, and made decisions based on experience rather than computer assistance. The T-6 had taught Elena to fly the way pilots had learned during the war, when aircraft were simpler but flying was infinitely more demanding. She had developed an instinctive understanding of how wind affected her aircraft, how to read engine sounds for signs of trouble, and how to make split-second decisions when everything went wrong. More importantly, she had learned to fly with precision that came from knowing her aircraft's capabilities and limitations intimately. But Elena's secret went deeper than just owning a vintage aircraft. Her grandfather, Miguel Rodriguez, had been a legendary pilot during World War II, flying P-51 Mustangs in the Pacific Theater. He had shot down 12 enemy aircraft and earned the Distinguished Flying Cross for his service. After the war, he had become a test pilot for aircraft manufacturers, pushing experimental planes to their. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Limits in helping develop the techniques that modern aviation still use today. Miguel had been known for his uncanny ability to outmaneuver larger, more powerful aircraft through superior skill and tactics. Elena had grown up listening to her grandfather's stories about aerial combat, aircraft design, and the lost art of instinctive flying. He had died when she was 16, but not before teaching her everything he knew about aviation. Every summer of her childhood, she had spent time at small airfields where Miguel would explain how aircraft worked, how weather affected flight, and how to read the sky like a book. He had taught her to think like a pilot long before she ever touched a control stick. "Mia," her grandfather would say in his gentle voice, "big engines and fancy equipment don't make you a pilot. Understanding your aircraft, respecting the weather, and making the right decision at the right moment, that's what separates real aviators from people who just know how to operate controls." He had emphasized that flying was about more than just getting from point A to point B. It was about becoming one with the aircraft and the environment, developing instincts that no amount of training could teach. After Miguel's death, Elena had inherited his flight logbooks, technical manuals, and most importantly, his philosophy about aviation. She had also inherited his 1952 T-6 Texan, the same aircraft he had used to train young pilots after the war. The plane had been sitting in storage for 15 years, but Elena had dedicated herself to bringing it back to life as a way of honoring her grandfather's memory. The restoration had taken 3 years of working evenings and weekends, learning mechanical skills that most modern pilots never developed. Elena had rebuilt the engine from scratch, replaced corroded control cables, and restored the aircraft's original military configuration. She had also installed modern safety equipment and communication systems, but she had preserved the T-6's authentic flying characteristics. The result was an aircraft that looked old but flew like new, capable of aerobatic maneuvers that would challenge even experienced pilots. Elena had earned her pilot's license using the T-6, learning to fly on an aircraft that demanded perfection from its pilot. She had developed skills that modern aviation training rarely taught, including formation flying, aerobatic maneuvers, and emergency procedures that could save lives when everything went wrong. She had also learned to fly by feel, developing an intuitive understanding of aircraft behavior that came from hundreds of hours in a demanding aircraft. But Elena had never told anyone at Skyline Aviation Academy about her background or her aircraft. She had taken the job as flight operations coordinator because she needed steady income to maintain her plane and pay off her restoration loan. She had also hoped that working around aviation would provide opportunities to learn more about modern aircraft and possibly transition to a career as a professional pilot. Instead, she had found herself trapped in a support role, treated as if she were incapable of understanding the very thing she was most passionate about. The situation at the academy had become increasingly frustrating over the past few months. Marcus's condescending attitude had gotten worse, and other students had begun copying his behavior. Elena found herself constantly having to prove her competence at basic tasks, even though she had been doing them flawlessly for 8 months. She was passed over for any opportunity to advance or learn new skills, and her suggestions about flight operations were dismissed without consideration. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning in September when Marcus arrived at the academy in a particularly foul mood. He had failed an instrument rating check ride the previous day, and his instructor had recommended additional training before attempting the test again. Marcus was clearly embarrassed by the failure, and he seemed determined to take his frustration out on Elena. "Ground girl," he announced loudly as he entered the flight operations office, "I need you to schedule me for 3 hours of instrument practice this afternoon. And this time, make sure the aircraft is properly preflighted. I don't have time to fix mistakes that should have been caught on the ground." Elena looked up from her paperwork and nodded calmly, but Marcus wasn't finished. "You know what your problem is?" he continued, his voice carrying across the office where several other students were reviewing flight plans. "You've been working around aircraft for months, but you still don't understand how they actually work. You see us flying these sophisticated machines, but you probably think it's just like driving a car. You have no idea what real flying requires." Elena set down her pen and looked at Marcus directly for the first time in weeks. "I understand aircraft operations," she said quietly. "I process flight plans, coordinate with air traffic control, and manage aircraft scheduling. I think I have a reasonable understanding of how things work." Marcus laughed, and several other students joined in. "Processing paperwork isn't the same as flying," he said. "You've never been responsible for an aircraft in flight. You've never had to make split-second decisions when weather changes or equipment fails. You've never felt what it's like to push a high-performance aircraft to its limits." He paused, dramatically, enjoying the attention from his audience. "I'll bet you've never even been in the cockpit of anything more complex than a Cessna 152, Marcus continued. "And even then, you probably needed the instructor to hold your hand through every maneuver. Real flying isn't something you can learn from books or simulators. It takes natural ability, proper training, and expensive equipment. Some people are cut out for it, and some people are meant to stay on the ground." Elena felt her face flush, but she kept her voice steady. "I've had some flight training," she said simply. "I understand the basics of aircraft operations and navigation." "Flight training?" Marcus's eyebrows shot up in mock surprise. "You mean you've actually been in a cockpit? What did you fly, a little Piper Cub? Did you manage to take off and land without crashing?" The other students were laughing openly now, and Elena could feel her grandfather's voice in her memory, telling her that respect had to be earned through actions, not words. "I fly a T-6 Texan," Elena said quietly. The laughter stopped abruptly, and Marcus's expression shifted to confusion. "A T-6? He said. "Those are military trainers from the 1940s. They don't even make those anymore." "Are you talking about some kind of simulator or museum exhibit?" "It's a 1952 North American T-6 Texan," Elena replied, "fully restored and airworthy. I keep it at Riverside Airfield." Marcus stared at her for a moment, then burst out laughing. "You own a T-6? Those things are antiques. They're basically toy planes compared to modern aircraft. They don't have GPS, autopilot, or any of the systems that real pilots use. Flying one of those museum pieces doesn't make you a pilot any more than driving a Model T makes you a race car driver." Elena felt something shift inside her, a quiet anger that had been building for months. "The T-6 is a complex aircraft," she said. "It requires precise control inputs, constant attention to engine parameters, and careful attention to weather conditions. It's actually more demanding to fly than most modern aircraft because it doesn't have electronic aids to compensate for pilot error." "More demanding?" Marcus's voice was incredulous. "Elena, I fly a Citation jet that cruises at 40,000 feet and 500 miles per hour. I deal with airline traffic, complex weather systems, and sophisticated navigation equipment. Your little toy plane probably can't even climb above 10,000 feet or fly faster than a modern car on the highway." The other students were listening intently now, sensing that something significant was happening. Elena stood up slowly, her decision crystallizing in her mind. "The T-6 has a service ceiling of 24,000 feet and a maximum speed of 212 miles per hour," she said. "It's capable of advanced aerobatic maneuvers, including loops, rolls, and inverted flight. It was designed to train combat pilots, not weekend recreational flyers." Marcus shook his head dismissively. "Look, Elena, I appreciate that you have a hobby, but owning an old airplane doesn't make you a pilot. Those vintage aircraft are fine for air shows and weekend fun, but they're not serious aviation. They're toys compared to what real pilots fly." He gestured toward the window where his Citation was parked on the ramp. "That's a real aircraft with real performance and real capabilities." Elena looked out at Marcus's jet, then back at him. "Would you like to see what my toy plane can do?" she asked. The office fell completely silent. Marcus stared at her, trying to process what she had just said. "What do you mean?" I mean, Elena said calmly, that if you're so confident about the superiority of your aircraft and your flying skills, perhaps you'd be interested in a demonstration. We could meet at Riverside Airfield this weekend. You can bring your citation, and I'll bring my T6. We can see which aircraft is really just a toy. Marcus's face went through several expressions before settling on amused skepticism. You're challenging me to some kind of flying contest? Elena, there's no comparison between a military jet and a World War II trainer. My aircraft is faster, more advanced, and infinitely more capable. It would be like comparing a Ferrari to a horse and buggy. Then you should have no problem demonstrating that superiority, Elena replied. Unless you're concerned that your expensive equipment might not be enough to overcome superior pilot skill. The challenge hung in the air like a thunderclap. Marcus looked around the office, realizing that everyone was watching him and waiting for his response. His reputation as the Academy's top student was at stake, and backing down from a challenge issued by the ground girl would be humiliating. Fine, he said finally. Saturday morning at Riverside Airfield, but I want witnesses. I want the other students to see what happens when amateur pilots try to play in the big leagues. He paused, then added with a cruel smile, and Elena, when this is over, I want you to admit in front of everyone that you're not cut out for real aviation. Some people are meant to stay on the ground, and it's time you learned that lesson. Elena nodded once. Saturday morning at 0800, she said. And Marcus? You might want to review your insurance policy before then. The remainder of the week passed in a blur of whispered conversations and growing anticipation. Word of the challenge had spread throughout the academy, and students were taking sides and placing bets on the outcome. Most favored Marcus heavily, reasoning that his military background, expensive aircraft, and professional training gave him an insurmountable advantage. A few students quietly supported Elena, mostly because they disliked Marcus's arrogant attitude. But even they had doubts about her chances. Elena spent the week preparing methodically. She reviewed her T6's maintenance logs, checked every system twice, and practiced maneuvers that she hadn't attempted in months. She also spent time researching the citation's performance characteristics, studying its strengths and weaknesses, and developing a strategy that would level the playing field. She knew that Marcus was a competent pilot, but she also knew that he had become dependent on his aircraft's advanced systems and had probably never faced an opponent who understood the fundamentals of aerial maneuvering. Marcus, meanwhile, seemed to be treating the upcoming encounter as a joke. He spent the week boasting about how quickly he would end Elena's aviation dreams and joking about the antique aircraft she would be flying. He seemed genuinely convinced that the challenge would be over within minutes, and he was already planning how he would use his victory to further humiliate Elena. On Friday evening, Elena drove to Riverside Airfield to give her T6 a final inspection. The small airport was quiet, with only a few aircraft tied down on the ramp and a single runway that looked tiny compared to Skyline Academy's facilities. Elena's hangar was at the far end of the field, away from the main terminal and mostly hidden from casual view. She pulled back the hangar door and looked at her aircraft in the fading light. The T6 might have looked old and simple compared to Marcus's jet, but Elena knew its capabilities intimately. She had spent hundreds of hours in its cockpit, learning to fly with precision that came from constant practice and deep understanding. Tomorrow, she would find out if her grandfather's lessons about skill-conquering technology were still relevant in the modern world. As she ran her hands along the aircraft's wing, Elena whispered a silent prayer to her grandfather's memory. She thought about all the young pilots he had trained, all the lives he had saved through his skill and knowledge, and all the lessons he had passed down to her. Tomorrow wasn't just about proving herself to Marcus and the other students at the academy. It was about honoring the legacy of a man who had believed that real flying came from the heart, not from the cockpit instruments. Elena locked the hangar and drove home, her mind already focused on the morning ahead. She had spent months being underestimated and dismissed, but tomorrow she would have the opportunity to show what she was truly capable of. The T6 might be old, but it was far from being a toy. And Elena Rodriguez was far from being just another ground crew member who didn't understand aviation. The stage was set for a confrontation that would change everything at Skyline Aviation Academy. Marcus had no idea what he was about to face, and Elena was counting on that overconfidence to give her the advantage she needed. Tomorrow would prove whether experience and skill could overcome arrogance and expensive equipment. The morning of reckoning was less than 12 hours away. Saturday morning arrived with perfect flying weather. The sun rose over Riverside Airfield, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, while a gentle breeze carried the familiar scent of aviation fuel and morning dew across the tarmac. Elena had been awake since 0500, running through her pre-flight checklist one final time and ensuring that every component of her T6 was functioning flawlessly. She had arrived at the airfield before dawn, wanting to complete her preparations without an audience. The T6 sat gleaming in the early morning light, its yellow paint scheme restored to military specifications with the distinctive red, white, and blue roundels marking it as a United States training aircraft. Elena had spent the previous evening polishing every surface until the old warbird looked like it had just rolled off the North American aviation production line. In 1952, the radial engine had been warmed and tested. The control surfaces moved freely through their full range of motion, and the fuel tanks held exactly the amount needed for what Elena had planned. By 0730, cars began arriving at Riverside Airfield carrying students and instructors from Skyline Aviation Academy. Word of the challenge had spread beyond the academy, and several local pilots had also come to witness what many expected to be a brief and decisive demonstration of modern aviation superiority. The small airfield's parking area quickly filled with vehicles as spectators gathered near the terminal building, discussing the upcoming encounter in hushed, excited voices. Marcus arrived fashionably late in his silver BMW, followed by a caravan of students who had chosen to ride with him rather than miss any opportunity to witness Elena's anticipated humiliation. He stepped out of his car wearing an immaculate flight suit with his name embroidered in gold letters, expensive leather boots, and aviator sunglasses that probably cost more than Elena's monthly rent. His confidence was palpable as he surveyed the modest airfield with obvious disdain. "So this is where Ground Girl keeps her museum piece," Marcus announced loud enough for everyone to hear. "I was expecting something a little more professional. But I suppose antique aircraft belong at antique airfields." Several students laughed appreciatively at his comment, though a few looked uncomfortable with his obvious attempt to intimidate Elena before the demonstration even began. Elena emerged from her hangar pushing the T6 by hand, a task that required considerable effort, but which she accomplished with practiced efficiency. The sight of the vintage aircraft drew immediate attention from the crowd, some of whom had never seen a World War II-era trainer up close. The T6's size was impressive, larger than many modern single-engine aircraft, with a wingspan of 42 feet and a length of nearly 30 feet. Its radial engine dominated the front of the aircraft, giving it an aggressive, purposeful appearance that spoke of serious aviation heritage. Marcus walked over to examine Elena's aircraft with the air of someone inspecting a curiosity at a museum. He ran his hand along the wing and peered into the cockpit, shaking his head with theatrical disappointment. "Elena, this thing is older than my father," he said. "Look at this instrumentation. It's like stepping back into the Stone Age of aviation. How do you even navigate without GPS? How do you maintain altitude without an autopilot? This isn't flying, it's just an exercise in nostalgia." Elena continued her external inspection without responding to Marcus's commentary. She checked the control surface linkages, examined the landing gear for proper extension, and verified that all external components were secure. Her movements were methodical and professional, the routine of someone who understood that proper pre-flight inspection could mean the difference between a successful flight and a catastrophic failure. You know what the difference is between your aircraft and mine? Marcus continued, gesturing toward the Citation that was being towed onto the ramp by a ground crew. My jet represents the pinnacle of modern aviation technology. Turbofan engines, glass cockpit displays, weather radar, traffic collision avoidance systems, and performance that your antique can't even dream of matching. This is what real aviation looks like in the 21st century. The Citation was indeed an impressive aircraft, sleek and modern with swept wings and engines mounted on the rear fuselage. Its white paint scheme was immaculate, and its interior was visible through large passenger windows that spoke of luxury and comfort. The jet represented everything that modern aviation had achieved, technology and performance that would have been unimaginable when Elena's T6 was built. Elena completed her pre-flight inspection and climbed into the T6's cockpit, adjusting her seat and checking that all controls moved freely. The cockpit was cramped compared to modern aircraft standards, with analog gauges arranged around a central instrument panel and controls that required physical strength to operate effectively. There were no computer screens, no electronic displays, and no automated systems to assist the pilot. Everything depended on the pilot's skill, experience, and ability to process multiple inputs simultaneously. Marcus finished his own much shorter pre-flight inspection and settled into the Citation's pilot seat, starting his engines with the push of a button and activating systems that would have seemed like magic to pilots from Elena's grandfather's generation. The jet's engines spooled up with a quiet whine, and Marcus began running through electronic checklists displayed on multiple screens surrounding his position. The crowd of spectators had grown to nearly 50 people, including several local pilots who had heard about the challenge through the aviation community's informal communication network. Most were clearly expecting to witness a brief demonstration of why modern aircraft had replaced older designs, but a few seemed genuinely curious about how the T6 would perform against the jet. Elena started her engine using a procedure that required precise timing and manual control of multiple systems. The radial engine coughed to life with a distinctive rumble that echoed across the airfield, settling into the irregular rhythm that characterized radial engines. Black smoke puffed from the exhaust stacks as the engine warmed, and the entire aircraft vibrated with mechanical energy that was both primitive and somehow more honest than the smooth operation of modern turbines. Marcus had requested that the challenge consist of 3 separate demonstrations. First, a straight-line speed contest to prove the Citation's superior performance. Second, a precision flying demonstration to show the advantages of modern navigation and control systems. Finally, an aerobatic display to highlight the differences between a training aircraft and a modern jet. He had designed the challenges to emphasize areas where his aircraft held obvious advantages, and he was confident that Elena's T6 would be embarrassed in each category. But Elena had spent the previous week developing her own strategy. She understood that she could not compete with the Citation in terms of raw speed or technological sophistication, but she also knew that Marcus had become dependent on his aircraft's automated systems and had probably never faced an opponent who understood the fundamental principles of aerial maneuvering. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her memory, reminding her that superior skill could overcome superior equipment if applied correctly. The first challenge began with both aircraft departing Riverside Airfield and flying a predetermined course. That would take them over the nearby lake and back to the airport. Marcus had suggested a simple speed contest, reasoning that his jet's 500-mile-per-hour cruise speed would easily defeat the T6's maximum speed of 212 miles per hour. Elena had agreed to the challenge, but she had not told Marcus about the modifications she had made to her route planning. Marcus took off first, his citation climbing rapidly and accelerating to cruise speed with the effortless power of modern turbofan engines. The jet disappeared from sight within minutes, climbing to its preferred altitude of 25,000 feet where thin air and powerful engines combined to produce maximum efficiency. Marcus was following a textbook flight plan, optimized for fuel economy and passenger comfort, flying the way civilian jets were designed to operate. Elena took off several minutes later, keeping her T6 at low altitude and following a route that took advantage of terrain features and wind patterns that Marcus had ignored. While the citation flew a direct path at high altitude, Elena followed valleys and ridgelines that provided natural wind assistance and shorter actual distances. She also utilized techniques that modern pilots rarely considered, such as riding updrafts created by terrain features and adjusting her route continuously based on real-time weather observations. The T6's lower altitude meant that Elena was fighting through denser air that reduced her maximum speed, but it also meant that she could take advantage of meteorological phenomena that were invisible to Marcus. Flying at 25,000 feet, she found tailwinds that added precious miles per hour to her ground speed, thermal updrafts that reduced her engine workload, and geographic shortcuts that were too dangerous for a jet flying at high speed, but perfectly manageable for an aircraft designed for low-altitude maneuvering. Marcus completed his circuit in the expected time, landing back at Riverside Airfield with the smug satisfaction of someone who had just proven an obvious point. His citation had performed exactly as advertised, cruising effortlessly at high speed and altitude while consuming fuel at an efficient rate. He shut down his engines and climbed out of the cockpit, expecting to wait several more minutes for Elena to complete the same course. Instead, he found Elena already on the ground, standing beside her T6 with a slight smile on her face. She had completed the circuit nearly 3 minutes faster than Marcus, despite flying an aircraft with less than half his maximum speed. The crowd of spectators was buzzing with confusion and surprise, trying to understand how the old trainer had beaten the modern jet in what should have been a straightforward speed competition. Marcus stared at Elena in disbelief. How is that possible? He demanded. My aircraft is twice as fast as yours. You couldn't have completed the same route in less time unless you cheated somehow. Elena pulled out her navigation chart, which was marked with pencil lines showing her actual flight path. I flew the same checkpoints as you, she said calmly, but I planned a more efficient route. While you were flying a direct path at high altitude, I followed terrain features that provided favorable winds and shorter distances. I also adjusted my route continuously based on current weather conditions rather than following a predetermined flight plan. Marcus examined Elena's chart with growing frustration. Her route was indeed more complex, following valleys and ridgelines that created a path nearly 20 miles shorter than his direct course. She had also noted wind directions and thermal activity that had allowed her to increase her effective ground speed beyond what her aircraft's maximum speed would suggest. That's not real flying, Marcus protested. You're using tricks and shortcuts that only work with primitive aircraft. Modern aviation is about precision and predictability, not improvisation and seat-of-the-pants navigation. Any airline pilot would tell you that following predetermined routes is the professional way to operate. My grandfather used to say that real flying meant adapting to conditions rather than fighting them, Elena replied. Modern aircraft are designed to overcome weather and terrain through brute force. Older aircraft require pilots to work with natural forces rather than against them. The second challenge was precision flying, a test that Marcus had designed to showcase the citation's advanced navigation systems and autopilot capabilities. The task required both aircraft to fly a specific pattern over the airfield, maintaining exact altitudes and headings while navigating through predetermined waypoints. Marcus was confident that his GPS navigation and autopilot system would provide accuracy that Elena's manual flying could never match. Marcus took off first, engaging his autopilot immediately after departure and programming his navigation system to fly the required pattern with computer-controlled precision. His aircraft maintained altitude within 10 feet and headings within 1 degree, exactly as the electronic systems had been programmed to do. The Citation flew the pattern like a machine, because that was essentially what it was doing, following electronic commands without any input from its human pilot. Elena's approach was entirely different. She flew the pattern manually, using visual references and instrument readings to maintain her position and heading. Her altitude varied by perhaps 50 feet during the maneuvers, and her headings were occasionally off by several degrees as she made continuous small corrections based on wind conditions and aircraft performance. To casual observers, it appeared that Marcus was achieving superior precision through his aircraft's advanced systems. But Elena was accomplishing something that Marcus's automated systems could not match. While the Citation followed its predetermined path regardless of wind conditions or air traffic, Elena was constantly adapting her flight path to maintain optimal position relative to other aircraft and changing weather conditions. When a flock of birds appeared in the Citation's programmed flight path, Marcus had to manually disengage his autopilot and deviate from his planned route. Elena simply adjusted her heading slightly and continued with her pattern without interruption. More importantly, Elena was demonstrating a level of aircraft control that impressed the experienced pilots in the crowd. Her T6 responded to control inputs with immediate precision, and she was able to make subtle adjustments that kept her aircraft in perfect position relative to ground references. She was flying the aircraft rather than simply monitoring its automated systems, showing a level of pilot skill that many modern aviators had never developed. The difference became apparent when both aircraft encountered unexpected wind shear during their final approach to the pattern. Marcus's autopilot attempted to maintain its programmed altitude and heading, but the sudden wind change caused the Citation to deviate significantly from its intended path. Marcus had to take manual control and make several large corrections. To get back on course, his movements sharp and jerky as he fought to overcome his aircraft's automated systems. Elena felt the wind shear immediately through her aircraft's controls and made a subtle adjustment to her power setting and control inputs that kept her T6 on a steady path throughout the disturbance. Her response was so smooth that casual observers barely noticed the wind change, but experienced pilots recognized that she had demonstrated superior situational awareness and aircraft control skills. When both aircraft landed and the results were compared, Elena had flown a more accurate pattern despite using manual controls and analog instruments. Her ability to adapt to changing conditions had given her an advantage that Marcus's automated systems could not match. More importantly, she had maintained better awareness of her surroundings and had been able to respond more quickly to unexpected situations. Marcus was clearly frustrated by the results of the first two challenges. His expensive aircraft and advanced systems had failed to provide the decisive advantage he had expected, and Elena's primitive flying techniques were proving to be more effective than he had anticipated. The crowd of spectators was beginning to murmur among themselves, recognizing that the challenge was not proceeding as most had expected. The final challenge was aerobatic flying, an area where Marcus felt confident that his military training would provide an insurmountable advantage. He had performed aerobatic maneuvers during his Air Force career, and while the Citation was not designed for extreme aerobatics, it was capable of basic maneuvers such as loops and rolls. Marcus believed that his experience with high performance military aircraft would allow him to push his jet beyond Elena's capabilities. Elena's T6, however, had been specifically designed for aerobatic training. Every structural component had been built to withstand the stresses of aerobatic flight, and the aircraft's control responses had been optimized for maneuvering rather than straight-line performance. Elena had spent hundreds of hours practicing aerobatic sequences in her aircraft, developing a level of precision that came from intimate familiarity with her machine's capabilities. Marcus took off first, climbing to altitude and beginning his aerobatic sequence with a series of basic maneuvers. His loops were adequate but lacked precision, with variations in airspeed and altitude that indicated he was fighting his aircraft's systems rather than working with them. His rolls were mechanically correct, but showed none of the fluid grace that characterized expert aerobatic flying. The Citation was performing the maneuvers, but it was clearly operating outside its comfort zone. Elena's demonstration was entirely different. Her T6 moved through the air with a grace and precision that seemed almost supernatural, each maneuver flowing seamlessly into the next in a sequence that appeared to be choreographed. Her loops were perfect circles, her rolls were executed at constant altitude and airspeed, and her transitions between maneuvers were so smooth that the aircraft seemed to be dancing rather than simply flying. But Elena's real demonstration came when she began performing maneuvers that Marcus had never attempted. She executed a perfect Cuban 8, a complex maneuver that required precise timing and control inputs throughout its entire sequence. She followed this with a series of knife-edge passes, flying her aircraft sideways while maintaining perfect altitude and heading control. Finally, she performed a tail slide, pulling her aircraft into a vertical climb until it stopped moving forward and slid backward through the air before recovering to normal flight. The crowd watched in stunned silence as Elena's T6 performed maneuvers that pushed the boundaries of what many had thought possible in a vintage aircraft. Her flying demonstrated not just technical skill, but an artistic sensibility that transformed aerobatic maneuvers into something approaching ballet. Every movement was deliberate and controlled, showing a level of aircraft mastery that few pilots ever achieved. Marcus attempted to match Elena's performance, but his Citation was not designed for the extreme maneuvers that Elena was performing effortlessly. When he tried to execute a Cuban 8, his aircraft systems began providing warnings about exceeding design limitations. His knife-edge passes were unstable and dangerous, requiring constant correction to maintain control. When he attempted a tail slide, his engines flamed out due to the extreme attitude, and he had to restart them during his recovery. The contrast between the two demonstrations was stark and unmistakable. Marcus was a competent pilot operating an advanced aircraft, but Elena was an artist working with an instrument that she understood completely. Her T6 responded to her control inputs as if it were an extension of her own body, while Marcus was clearly struggling to maintain control of his jet during maneuvers that stressed both aircraft and pilot beyond their normal operating envelope. When both aircraft landed after the aerobatic demonstration, the crowd was no longer murmuring quietly among themselves. They were discussing what they had witnessed in the amazed tones of people who had seen something genuinely extraordinary. Elena's flying had transformed their understanding of what was possible with skill and experience, while Marcus's performance had demonstrated the limitations of relying too heavily on technological advantages. Marcus climbed out of his Citation, visibly shaken by the experience. His confidence had evaporated during the aerobatic sequence, replaced by the uncomfortable realization that his assumptions about aviation superiority had been completely wrong. Elena's toy plane had not only matched his jet's performance but had exceeded it in every meaningful category. More importantly, Elena herself had demonstrated a level of piloting skill that made his own abilities seem pedestrian by comparison. Elena shut down her T6's engine and climbed out of the cockpit with the same calm demeanor she had maintained throughout the entire challenge. She showed no signs of excitement or triumph, simply the quiet satisfaction of someone who had performed exactly as expected. Her flying had been a masterclass in aviation skill, but she seemed to regard it as nothing more than a normal demonstration of her aircraft's capabilities. The spectators began approaching Elena with questions about her background and her aircraft, clearly impressed by what they had witnessed. Several experienced pilots wanted to know where she had learned to fly with such precision, while others were curious about the modifications she had made to her T6 to achieve such performance. Elena answered their questions politely but briefly, uncomfortable with the sudden attention but willing to share information about her grandfather's training methods and her aircraft's restoration. Marcus stood apart from the crowd, struggling to process what had just happened. His entire worldview about modern aviation superiority had been shattered in the space of 2 hours, and he was facing the uncomfortable realization that his expensive equipment and professional training had been no match for Elena's skill and experience. The ground girl he had dismissed as incompetent had just demonstrated flying abilities that exceeded anything he had ever achieved. But the real shock came when Marcus received a phone call from his insurance company later that afternoon. The Citation's engine restart during his failed tailslide attempt had been recorded by the aircraft's flight data recorder, and the insurance company's automated monitoring system had flagged the incident as a potential violation of his policy terms. Marcus had not informed his insurance company that he would be performing aerobatic maneuvers, and his policy specifically excluded coverage for aerobatic flight or any operation outside the aircraft's approved flight envelope. The insurance company was not only canceling Marcus's coverage immediately but was also demanding repayment of claims they had previously covered based on his misrepresentation of his flying activities. Marcus faced the prospect of losing his aircraft insurance entirely, making it impossible for him to operate his Citation legally. Without insurance coverage, his expensive jet would be nothing more than a very costly piece of static display equipment. Marcus called Elena that evening, his voice subdued and lacking any trace of his former arrogance. "Elena, I need to talk to you," he said. "I've got a serious problem with my insurance, and I think you might be the only person who can help me." Elena listened as Marcus explained his situation. His insurance company had discovered his unauthorized aerobatic flying and was not only canceling his policy, but demanding financial penalties that would cost him tens of thousands of dollars. He needed someone with demonstrated aerobatic experience to vouch for his flying competence and help him find a new insurance company that would cover his aircraft. "Why are you calling me?" Elena asked. "This morning you said I wasn't a real pilot. You called my aircraft a toy and suggested that I belonged on the ground instead of in the air." Marcus was quiet for a long moment before responding. "Because this morning I learned that I was wrong about everything," he said finally. "I've been flying for years, but I've never seen anyone handle an aircraft the way you did today. I've been relying on technology and automation instead of developing real flying skills. You showed me what real piloting looks like, and I realized that I have a lot to learn." Elena considered Marcus's request carefully. She had no obligation to help the man who had spent months mocking her and dismissing her abilities. On the other hand, her grandfather had always taught her that aviation was a community where pilots helped each other regardless of personal differences. Flying was dangerous enough without allowing pride and ego to prevent pilots from supporting one another when help was needed. "I'll make some phone calls," Elena said finally. "I know some insurance companies that specialize in aerobatic coverage, and I can provide references for your flying abilities. But Marcus, if I help you with this, I want something in return." "Anything," Marcus replied quickly. "Name it." "I want a job as a flight instructor at the academy," Elena said. "Not as ground crew or flight operations coordinator, but as a real instructor teaching real students. I want the opportunity to pass on the flying techniques my grandfather taught me." Marcus agreed immediately, recognizing that Elena's demonstrated abilities would make her an invaluable addition to the Academy's teaching staff. More importantly, he realized that having Elena as an instructor would give him the opportunity to learn from someone whose flying skills far exceeded his own. Within a week, Elena had helped Marcus secure new insurance coverage with a company that specialized in aerobatic and experimental aircraft. She had also begun her new position as a flight instructor at Skyline Aviation Academy, where her reputation for precision flying and technical knowledge had preceded her. Students who had previously dismissed her as incompetent ground crew were now competing for the opportunity to train with someone who had demonstrated such extraordinary flying abilities. Elena's teaching style was understated but incredibly effective. She emphasized fundamental flying skills over technological dependence, teaching her students to develop the kind of instinctive aircraft control that came from understanding rather than automation. Her classes were always full, and her students consistently achieved higher ratings and better performance than those trained by other instructors. Marcus became one of Elena's most dedicated students, approaching his training with the humility of someone who had learned that true aviation mastery required more than just expensive equipment and professional credentials. He discovered that Elena's teaching methods revealed aspects of flying that he had never considered, and his own flying abilities improved dramatically under her guidance. The incident at Riverside Airfield became legendary within the aviation community, a story that was retold whenever pilots gathered to discuss the importance of fundamental flying skills over technological dependence. Elena's demonstration had proven that superior pilot technique could overcome apparent equipment disadvantages, a lesson that resonated with aviators who remembered when flying required skill rather than just systems management. Elena continued flying her T-6, but now she used it as a teaching aircraft for students who wanted to learn advanced techniques and develop superior aircraft control skills. The old trainer that Marcus had dismissed as a toy became one of the most respected aircraft in the region, sought after by pilots who wanted to experience what real flying felt like. The story of Elena Rodriguez and her 1952 T-6 Texan had become more than just an aviation anecdote. It had become a reminder that expertise and skill could never be replaced by technology and equipment, and that true mastery came from understanding fundamental principles rather than relying on automated systems. Elena had proven that sometimes the oldest aircraft, flown by the most skilled pilot, could outperform the newest technology operated by someone who had forgotten what real flying meant. The transformation at Skyline Aviation Academy was nothing short of remarkable. Within 3 weeks of Elena's demonstration at Riverside Airfield, the entire culture of the institution had shifted dramatically. Students who had previously focused exclusively on operating the most advanced aircraft available were now requesting training in fundamental flying techniques that had been largely forgotten in modern aviation education. The Academy's enrollment in basic aerobatics courses increased by 400%, and Elena found herself scheduled for instruction from dawn until dusk. Elena's first official day as a flight instructor began at 0600 with a ground school session on manual navigation techniques. 23 students packed into a classroom designed for 15, all eager to learn the skills that Elena had demonstrated so effectively against Marcus's high-tech approach. She stood at the front of the room wearing the same simple clothing she had worn as flight operations coordinator, but now she commanded immediate respect and attention from every person present. "Modern aircraft can take you anywhere you want to go," Elena began, her voice carrying the quiet authority that came from genuine expertise. "GPS will guide you along the most efficient route. Autopilot will maintain your altitude and heading, and weather radar will help you avoid dangerous conditions. These are all valuable tools, but they're not substitutes for understanding how aircraft actually behave in the environment where they operate." She walked to a large navigation chart mounted on the classroom wall, pointing to various terrain features and explaining how they affected wind patterns, turbulence, and navigation options. "My grandfather used to say that every flight was a conversation between the pilot, the aircraft, and the weather. Modern technology can translate that conversation for you, but it can't teach you to understand what's actually being said." The students listened with an intensity that Elena had never seen during her months working as ground crew. These were The same people who had ignored her completely when she was cleaning their aircraft and processing their flight plans. But now they hung on every word, as if she were revealing the secrets of flight itself. Marcus sat in the front row, taking notes with the dedication of someone who had discovered how much he still needed to learn. Elena's teaching methodology was unlike anything the Academy had previously offered. Instead of focusing on systems, management, and technology operation, she emphasized developing intuitive understanding of aircraft behavior and environmental conditions. Her students learned to feel changes in aircraft performance through control pressure variations, to read weather patterns through cloud formations and wind indicators, and to navigate using landmarks and compass headings rather than GPS coordinates. Real flying skill comes from pattern recognition, Elena explained during a discussion of emergency procedures. When something goes wrong, you don't have time to consult checklists or wait for computer analysis. You need to recognize what's happening immediately and respond with the right technique automatically. That kind of ability only comes from experience with aircraft that demand constant attention and manual control. Elena's ground school sessions were followed by flight training that challenged students in ways they had never experienced. Instead of climbing immediately to cruise altitude and engaging autopilot, Elena's students spent hours practicing low-altitude maneuvering, manual navigation, and precision flying without electronic aids. They learned to fly traffic patterns by visual reference, to calculate fuel consumption manually, and to make landing approaches using nothing but airspeed control and visual judgment. The results were dramatic and immediate. Students who had struggled with basic flying skills when relying on automated systems discovered that they could achieve remarkable precision when forced to develop manual control techniques. Their situational awareness improved dramatically when they could no longer depend on computer displays to provide aircraft status information. Most importantly, they began to understand their aircraft as dynamic systems that required constant pilot input rather than as transportation devices that operated automatically. Elena's most challenging student was, ironically, Marcus himself. His years of flying with advanced automation had created habits that were difficult to overcome, and his initial attempts at manual flying were frustrating for both instructor and student. Marcus had become accustomed to making large control inputs and allowing his aircraft systems to smooth out his technique. But Elena's T6 responded immediately and sometimes dramatically to every control movement. "You're fighting the aircraft instead of flying it," Elena observed during Marcus's third lesson in the T6. They were practicing basic aerobatic maneuvers, and Marcus was struggling to maintain consistent airspeed and altitude through the sequence. "You keep trying to force it to do what you want instead of working with what it's trying to tell you." Marcus took a deep breath and tried to relax his grip on the control stick. "It's so different from what I'm used to," he admitted. "In the citation, I set the autopilot and monitor the systems. Here, every second requires active input and constant attention. I feel like I'm drinking from a fire hose." "That's exactly right," Elena replied. "Modern aircraft are designed to minimize pilot workload and reduce the chance of error through automation. But they also reduce the pilot's connection to the flying process. You're learning to actually fly rather than just manage systems." Elena's patient instruction gradually helped Marcus develop skills that he had never possessed even during his military career. His control inputs became smoother and more precise. His awareness of aircraft performance increased dramatically, and his ability to handle unexpected situations improved significantly. More importantly, he began to understand what Elena had been trying to tell him about the relationship between pilot skill and aircraft capability. The transformation was not limited to flying technique. Elena's presence at the Academy had created a fundamental shift in how students approached aviation education. Previously, the focus had been on operating the most advanced and expensive aircraft available, with success measured by the sophistication of the equipment rather than the skill of the operator. Elena's demonstration had proven that pilot ability was more important than technological advancement, and students began requesting training that emphasized skill development over equipment operation. Elena developed a comprehensive curriculum that combined traditional flying techniques with modern safety practices. Her students learned aerobatic maneuvers not for entertainment, but as a way to understand aircraft behavior in extreme conditions. They practiced emergency procedures in actual aircraft rather than simulators, developing muscle memory and decision-making, skills that could save lives when automation failed. Most importantly, they learned to think like pilots rather than systems operators. The Academy's insurance costs decreased dramatically as Elena's students demonstrated superior safety records and emergency handling capabilities. Insurance companies recognized that pilots trained in fundamental flying skills were less likely to be involved in accidents caused by automation dependency or inadequate manual flying ability. Elena's teaching methods were producing pilots who could handle any situation regardless of equipment failures or system malfunctions. Word of Elena's instruction methods spread throughout the aviation community, attracting students from across the country who wanted to experience training that emphasized skill over technology. The Academy's reputation shifted from being known for expensive equipment to being recognized for producing exceptionally competent pilots. Airlines and corporate flight departments began specifically recruiting graduates of Elena's program, recognizing the superior abilities of pilots who had learned to fly rather than just operate aircraft systems. Elena's T6 became the Academy's most popular training aircraft despite being the oldest and least technologically advanced plane on the field. Students competed for the opportunity to fly the vintage trainer, recognizing that time in the T6 would develop flying skills that were impossible to achieve in modern aircraft. The old warbird that Marcus had dismissed as a museum piece was now considered the most valuable educational tool at one of the region's premier flight training institutions. Elena's success as an instructor led to recognition throughout the aviation industry. She was invited to speak at safety seminars, contribute to aviation magazines, and consult with airlines about pilot training programs. Her message was always the same. Fundamental flying skills were more important than technological proficiency, and pilots who understood their aircraft intimately were safer and more capable than those who relied primarily on automation. But Elena's greatest satisfaction came from watching her students develop into confident, competent pilots who understood aviation as both art and science. She had seen too many accidents caused by pilots who became confused when their automated systems failed or who made poor decisions because they lacked intuitive understanding of aircraft behavior. Her students were different. They could handle any aircraft in any conditions because they understood the fundamental principles that governed flight. Marcus's transformation was perhaps the most dramatic example of Elena's teaching effectiveness. The arrogant pilot who had mocked her toy plane had become one of her most dedicated advocates, frequently speaking to other pilots about the importance of fundamental flying skills. His insurance crisis had been resolved not just through Elena's connections but through his demonstrated improvement as a pilot after training with her methods. "Elena saved my aviation career," Marcus told a group of pilots at the Academy's annual safety seminar. "I thought I was a competent pilot because I could operate sophisticated equipment, but I had never learned to actually fly," Elena taught me that being a pilot means more than just managing systems. It means understanding aircraft, weather, and the environment as integrated elements that require constant attention and skill. Marcus had also become an advocate for traditional flying techniques among his former military colleagues. His experience with Elena's training had convinced him that modern military aviation was producing system operators rather than pilots, and he began encouraging other ex-military aviators to seek training that would develop the skills that automation had allowed them to avoid learning. Elena's influence extended beyond individual students to the aviation industry as a whole. Her emphasis on manual flying skills and fundamental understanding influenced training programs at major airlines, which began incorporating elements of her methodology into their pilot development curricula. The Federal Aviation Administration consulted with Elena about revising training requirements to ensure that pilots maintained manual flying competency, even as aircraft became increasingly automated. The old T6 that had started Elena's transformation became a symbol of her teaching philosophy. The aircraft represented an era when pilots had to understand their machines completely because survival depended on skill rather than technology. Elena used the T6 to demonstrate that fundamental flying principles remained constant, regardless of technological advancement, and that pilots who mastered these principles could operate any aircraft safely and effectively. Elena's personal satisfaction came not from recognition or professional success, but from knowing that she was honoring her grandfather's legacy while preparing pilots for careers that prioritized safety and competence over technological dependence. Every student who learned to read weather patterns visually, navigate by compass and landmark, or recover from unusual attitudes through instinctive control inputs, was carrying forward techniques that had been developed through decades of aviation experience. The Academy established the Elena Rodriguez Memorial Fund for Aviation Education, honoring Elena's grandfather's contributions to pilot training and supporting students who wanted to learn traditional flying techniques. Elena donated her instructor fees to the fund, ensuring that financial limitations would not prevent dedicated students from accessing the kind of training that had shaped her own aviation education. Elena's story became required reading in aviation safety courses, not because of the dramatic confrontation with Marcus, but because it illustrated the importance of maintaining fundamental flying skills in an increasingly automated industry. Her example showed that expertise and dedication could overcome apparent disadvantages, and that true aviation competence came from understanding rather than technology. The transformation at Skyline Aviation Academy represented more than just a change in training methodology. It represented a return to aviation values that emphasized skill, knowledge, and respect for the forces that governed flight. Elena's students graduated with capabilities that set them apart in an industry where too many pilots had become dependent on systems that could fail when they were needed most. Elena continued flying her T6 not as a demonstration of vintage aircraft capabilities, but as a reminder that real flying required constant engagement between pilot and machine. Every flight was an opportunity to practice techniques that modern training often ignored, and every landing was a validation of skills that could mean the difference between routine operation and emergency survival. The modest flight operations coordinator, who had been dismissed as ground girl, had become one of the most respected instructors in regional aviation. Her quiet competence and deep knowledge had transformed not just individual students, but an entire institution's approach to pilot education. More importantly, she had proven that expertise earned through dedication and practice would always be more valuable than equipment purchased with money. Elena's grandfather would have been proud to see how his lessons about aviation fundamentals had influenced a new generation of pilots. His emphasis on understanding aircraft behavior, respecting environmental conditions, and maintaining manual flying skills had found new expression through Elena's teaching. The techniques he had learned during World War II and passed on to his granddaughter were now being taught to pilots, who would carry them forward into the future of aviation. The story of Elena Rodriguez and her T6 Texan had become more than just an inspiring anecdote about overcoming prejudice and proving competence. It had become a catalyst for positive change in aviation education, demonstrating that the oldest principles of flight remained relevant in the most modern aircraft. Elena's example showed that true expertise came from understanding rather than equipment, and that the best pilots were those who combined technological capability with fundamental flying skills. As Elena prepared for another day of instruction, she looked out at the flight line where her students were pre-flighting aircraft ranging from vintage trainers to modern jets. Each pilot was beginning a journey that would be shaped by the techniques and principles she had learned from her grandfather and refined through years of dedicated practice. They would face challenges and opportunities that she could not imagine, but they would meet them with skills and knowledge that had been proven effective through decades of aviation experience. Elena touched her grandfather's watch, still worn, on her wrist after all these years, and smiled at the thought that his influence continued to grow through every student she taught and every pilot who learned to fly with understanding rather than automation. The quiet flight operations coordinator had become a teacher whose impact would be felt throughout the aviation community for generations to come. The ripple effects of Elena's transformation at Skyline Aviation Academy continued to spread throughout the aviation community over the following months. Her unconventional teaching methods and emphasis on fundamental flying skills began attracting attention from unexpected quarters, including a delegation from the International Civil Aviation Organization who wanted to study her curriculum for potential incorporation into global pilot training standards. Dr. Sarah Chun, a flight safety researcher from the University of Michigan, arrived at the academy on a crisp October morning to observe Elena's teaching methods firsthand. Dr. Chun had spent 15 years studying aviation accidents and had noticed a troubling pattern in recent incidents involving highly automated aircraft. Pilots were increasingly struggling to maintain control when their automated systems failed, and many accidents could be traced to inadequate manual flying skills rather than mechanical failures or weather conditions. Elena welcomed Dr. Chun's observation with the same quiet professionalism she applied to all her activities. Modern aircraft are incredibly safe when everything works correctly, Elena explained as they walked toward the flight line where her morning class was preparing for departure. The problem comes when something unexpected happens and pilots need to rely on fundamental flying skills that they've never fully developed. Dr. Chun spent a week observing Elena's instruction methods, documenting the techniques and principles that made her students notably more competent than graduates of traditional programs. She was particularly interested in Elena's use of stress inoculation training, where students practiced emergency procedures in actual flight conditions rather than sterile simulator environments. Elena's students learned to make critical decisions while experiencing the physiological and psychological pressures of real emergencies. Traditional training teaches students to follow procedures, Dr. Chun observed during a debriefing session. Elena's methods teach students to understand why those procedures exist and how to adapt them when circumstances don't match the textbook scenarios. Her students develop judgment and intuition that can't be programmed into any computer system. The research study that resulted from Dr. Chun's observations would eventually influence pilot training requirements worldwide, but Elena was more focused on the immediate needs of her students than on academic recognition. She had developed a reputation for accepting the most challenging students, including experienced pilots who had developed bad habits through years of automation dependency and new students who struggled with traditional instruction methods. One such student was Captain Jennifer Walsh, a 42-year-old airline pilot with over 8,000 flight hours, who had been referred to Elena after a series of concerning performance evaluations. Jennifer had been flying commercial aircraft for 15 years, but her recent check rides had revealed deficiencies in manual flying skills that her airline's training department couldn't address through conventional methods. "I feel like I'm starting over," Jennifer admitted during her first meeting with Elena. "I can operate any automated system perfectly, but when the computers are turned off, I struggle with basic aircraft control. It's embarrassing and terrifying, especially when I'm responsible for passengers' lives." Elena understood Jennifer's frustration. because she had seen it in dozens of experienced pilots who had become too dependent on automation. "You haven't forgotten how to fly," Elena assured her. "You've just learned to let computers do the flying for you. We're going to help you rediscover skills that are still there, buried under years of system management." Jennifer's retraining began with fundamentals that seemed almost insultingly basic for an experienced airline captain. Elena had her practice straight and level flight in the T6, focusing on maintaining altitude and heading through control feel rather than instrument reference. It was harder than Jennifer had expected, requiring constant small adjustments and continuous attention to aircraft behavior. In your airliner, the autopilot makes hundreds of tiny corrections every minute, Elena explained as Jennifer struggled to maintain steady flight. "You've forgotten what it feels like to make those corrections yourself. Your hands need to relearn how to interpret what the aircraft is telling you through the controls." Over several weeks, Jennifer progressed from basic aircraft control to advanced maneuvers that challenged her understanding of aircraft behavior. She learned to recover from unusual attitudes using nothing but attitude and airspeed references, to navigate using pilotage and dead reckoning, and to handle emergencies through immediate action rather than checklist consultation. Most importantly, she began to redevelop the intuitive sense of aircraft behavior that had been masked by years of automation dependency. The transformation was remarkable. Jennifer's airline check rides improved dramatically, and her confidence in handling unexpected situations returned to levels she hadn't experienced since her early flying career. She became an advocate for manual flying skills within her airline, eventually leading to changes in their training program that incorporated elements of Elena's methodology. Elena's success with challenging students led to contracts with major airlines seeking to improve their pilots' manual flying competency. She developed standardized training modules that could be implemented at various institutions while maintaining the core principles that made her methods effective. The contrast between her approach and traditional training was stark enough that airlines began measuring the difference in performance between pilots trained through different methodologies. The data was compelling. Pilots trained using Elena's emphasis on fundamental skills demonstrated superior performance in emergency situations, better decision-making under pressure, and significantly lower accident rates throughout their careers. Insurance companies began offering premium reductions for pilots who could demonstrate completion of training programs based on Elena's methods, recognizing the reduced risk associated with superior manual flying skills. Elena's influence extended beyond pilot training to aircraft design itself. Manufacturers began consulting with her about cockpit layouts and automation interfaces that would support rather than replace pilot skill development. Her input led to design changes that maintained pilot engagement with aircraft control while still providing the efficiency and safety benefits of modern automation. The T6 that had started Elena's journey became the centerpiece of a growing fleet of training aircraft specifically chosen for their ability to develop fundamental flying skills. The Academy acquired additional vintage aircraft, including a 1943 Stearman biplane and a 1956 Beechcraft Bonanza, each selected for its unique characteristics and training value. Students progressed through increasingly complex aircraft, building skills incrementally rather than jumping directly to highly automated systems. Marcus had become Elena's unofficial assistant instructor, his own transformation serving as a powerful example of what dedicated training could accomplish. His experience transitioning from automation dependency to manual flying competency made him particularly effective at helping other experienced pilots overcome similar challenges. His insurance crisis had been completely resolved, but more importantly, his flying abilities had improved to levels he had never achieved even during his military career. "Elena didn't just teach me to fly better," Marcus explained to a group of airline captains attending one of Elena's weekend seminars. She taught me to understand flying in a completely different way. I used to think of aircraft as machines that I operated. Now I understand them as dynamic systems that require continuous interaction and understanding. The weekend seminars had become legendary in aviation circles, attracting pilots from around the world who wanted to experience Elena's teaching methods. The sessions combined ground instruction and aviation fundamentals with intensive flight training in aircraft that demanded manual flying skills. Participants consistently rated the seminars as transformative experiences that changed their approach to aviation. Elena's reputation had grown to the point where she was invited to speak at major aviation conferences and contribute to international discussions about pilot training standards. Her presentations were always well attended, not because of dramatic storytelling, but because of the practical value of her insights into developing superior pilot competency. The Elena Rodriguez Memorial Fund had grown into a significant scholarship program that supported students seeking training in fundamental flying skills. Elena's donations had been supplemented by contributions from airlines, aircraft manufacturers, and individual pilots who recognized the value of preserving traditional aviation knowledge for future generations. Elena's personal flying had evolved as well. She had acquired a 1945 P-51 Mustang, the same type of aircraft her grandfather had flown during World War II. The fighter plane represented the ultimate expression of the flying skills she taught, requiring precision and competency that left no room for error or automation dependency. She used the P-51 for advanced training and airshow demonstrations that illustrated the highest levels of pilot-aircraft integration. The story of Elena's confrontation with Marcus had become a case study taught in aviation psychology courses, illustrating how preconceptions and bias could blind people to competence and expertise. The incident was cited in discussions about diversity in aviation, workplace dynamics, and the importance of recognizing talent regardless of its presentation. Elena remained fundamentally unchanged by her success in recognition. She continued to approach teaching with the same quiet intensity that had characterized her work as flight operations coordinator, focused on helping students develop the skills and understanding that would make them safer and more competent pilots. Her satisfaction came from watching students discover capabilities they hadn't known they possessed and seeing them apply those skills throughout their aviation careers. The Academy had expanded significantly to accommodate the demand for Elena's training programs, but it had maintained the personal approach that made her instruction so effective. Elena insisted on teaching every advanced course personally, refusing offers to franchise her methods or create automated training systems that would dilute the human element that made her approach successful. As Elena prepared for another day of instruction, she reflected on how much had changed since that morning when Marcus had challenged her competence and dismissed her aircraft as a toy. The quiet flight operations coordinator, who had endured months of condescension and dismissal, had become one of the most influential figures in modern aviation education. But her core mission remained the same, honoring her grandfather's legacy. By teaching pilots to fly with skill, understanding, and respect for the forces that governed flight. The old hangar where Elena had once hidden her T-6 from curious eyes now housed a collection of training aircraft that represented the evolution of aviation technology while maintaining the connection to fundamental flying skills. Students came from around the world to experience training that emphasized pilot competency over technological dependence, carrying Elena's lessons back to their own flying careers and passing them on to future generations of aviators. Elena's transformation from overlooked ground crew to respected instructor had proven that expertise and dedication would always find recognition, even when it came from unexpected sources. Her story continued to inspire pilots who faced their own challenges and setbacks, demonstrating that competence earned through practice and understanding would ultimately overcome any prejudice or preconception. The legacy of Miguel Rodriguez lived on through every student Elena taught and every pilot who learned to fly with the skills and principles he had passed down through his granddaughter. The quiet wisdom that had shaped Elena's approach to aviation continued to influence an industry that was constantly evolving, but still depended on the fundamental relationship between pilot, aircraft, and environment that had defined flying since its earliest days. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.